And hello, welcome to the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. I'm John Galloway. I'm a PM on the .NET Community team. Today I'm joined by Taylor Southwick. And Taylor, you're going to be talking about incremental migration to ASP.NET Core, right?
That is correct, yes.
That is awesome. And we were talking before this started, you are part of the customer success CSE team, customer success engineering, is that right? Or am I
it's all, there's a lot of names you've gone by, but
Okay.
We're under DevDiv, we're in the engineering org. We are specifically tasked with meeting with customers, seeing where they're at, and identifying challenges they have with our platforms and tools. So I specifically have been focused for the past, I don't know, it's probably been about 7 or 8 years now, on .NET Framework to .NET Core and ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core. And over the past few years, we've been trying to identify what are the biggest challenges for large applications moving to ASP.NET Core, and what can we do to help with that process.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, and as we were talking about beforehand, I don't think a lot of people know that we actually have a team that focuses on that. So.
Right, and that we're not in the sales org, we're engineers within the developer division. And we kind of ran the whole gamut of the projects and platforms, tools, everything that we produce, looking at that end-to-end experience that a customer looking at our tooling would actually see when they try to use it, without really worrying about those divisional lines that sometimes may show in products.
Yeah, very cool. All right, I see we're being rated by C# Fritz. That's always exciting. So cool. Let me jump into our community links and let's go with that. So those are here. And here. All right, Jeff Fritz, what were you folks talking about today on your stream? Okay, so here are the community links, and I also have a banner for it, and that is right here. Okay, so let us go and stream. And first link we got is we have an event on Thursday, 2 hours on auth and identity. This is something where we've seen people asking for guidance and having a lot of questions on getting started with auth and identity. So this is covering two things with auth and identity. The first half, we're covering ASP.NET identity stuff. And then second half, we're going into, we're doing the Microsoft identity. I think actually we have them switched around on here, but the Microsoft identity part is going to be interesting for me. And that's all the incrementing with like, or implementing with like Azure AD and everything. So I'm excited about that. We also have coming up, we have .NET Conf focus on Maui. So that is coming up soon. That is, I believe, August 9th. And wow, that's 20,000 followers, Jeff. That is amazing. Very cool. All right, so .NET Conf focus on Maui. A lot of great streams or sessions, and this is all kinds of stuff on focusing, actually going deep and building things, an entire day of content. So that is neat. OpenID or OpenID Dict, I guess is how you say it. I'm not sure. So Kevin shared this with me. This is the 4.0 preview 1 is out, and it's got a client stack. That is kind of the big change there, and support for well-known service integrations. So there's several listed here: Apple, GitHub, Google, Microsoft, Reddit, Twitter, and likely more from the community, which is really cool. I'll be following along with this, and I'll try and get Kevin on the show when it actually gets closer to release. So very cool package and very popular for identity implementation on ASP.NET Core. Rick Strahl has a post here on rendering Razer views to a string in an ASP.NET Core app. So he talks about how to, capture the Razer output. This is in the context of a running ASP.NET Core application. So he shows how to do that. And then in the comments, there's also a lot of people saying you can also use this package or that package. Those are helpful for cases where you're not doing that within the context of an application. So his is actually, capturing, and it's doing things like, rendering, making sure it's going to look nice. And people do this, especially as he mentions here, for things like formatted emails or reports. Recommend also checking out the comments for other popular packages that people use for this. As Rick points out, his is in the context of a running app, and these other ones are all kind of for more standalone solutions. All right. Really cool one from Niels. This is on finding a US representative, hooking together SMS, ASP.NET Core. He's using Twilio. He's using I wasn't aware of this, but there is a Google Civic Information API. And so he's hooking that all together. And the idea is you text to this thing, you text your phone number, and it can return the actual district you're in. As he mentions, I think he shows in here, I scrolled by pretty fast, but some of these district lines are pretty crazy. And so it's pretty neat that that number one, there's an API that can figure it out. And number two, then seeing this all integrated together. And he shows here on this where he texts several different, phone numbers or addresses in and gets back, what representative is for that area. So cool stuff. This is one I'm excited about here. This is Steve Sanderson tweeted this out. This is a first look at it. I'll try and get him on the show as it gets closer to a release. But this is it's called Quick Grid for Blazor, and the idea is it's being put out in the ASP labs. It's not a huge as he calls out here, it's not an official part of .NET 7, but you're welcome to use it like any other third-party open source project. And he has tons of different things in here, hooking up to different data sources, for instance. One thing that's really neat is virtualizing. So the idea with virtualizing is it's a load on demand. And so here he's working with, I think, 100,000 items or 22,000 items, and it loads on demand. The reason for doing that is otherwise you're loading all this information. You've got a really heavy page, and it can take a while to actually be useful. So here it's something where it's just loading as you scroll. For all of these, he's got cool code samples showing how it's implemented. So anyways, I'm excited to kind of follow along with this. He's even got in the styling. If you want Comic Sans, he's got you covered. So some really great stuff there. All right, Andrew Locke. It's been a little bit since I featured one from him. There's a ton of content constantly on his blog, so I recommend following this regularly. Here he's updated a previous post, and he's updated it for .NET 6, and this is using the middleware analysis package. And this can be really useful for understanding. Middleware can be complicated as you're trying to understand how your application is actually running, what's happening, how the different middleware is affecting each other, if something is causing a problem with loading. So he goes through and talks about how to, first of all, add middleware to your application and adding this package in. So Microsoft ASP.NET Core middleware analysis. And then he just walks through the case, creating an adapter, writing out diagnostics, then adding in this middleware. And I would think normally you'll want to do this inside the, when you're running in development. But I guess not always necessarily, depending on your log output and stuff. So then finally he shows here understanding the analysis output. So very cool. Yep, I agree. Great stuff, Andrew. Thank you as always. Okay, so I've got a few links here to share, and then I'll turn over you to Taylor. The first one here is this blog post recently, which is on Incremental ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core migration. So this talks about, well, first of all, mentioning how we've got a lot of large internal customers at Microsoft, people that are using ASP.NET Core at scale, and have worked through real life migrations. And this is something that real world people don't just get to stop their running application. You've got to keep your application running, and it can take a while to get through that. So he talks about this strangler fig pattern. Before working at Microsoft, I remember doing this, moving from classic ASP to ASP.NET on .NET Framework. Like this is just a standard pattern. And I worked through an application that had 20,000 ASP files because it was created mostly by vendors over time. And so we used exactly this. We created this thing and just slowly replaced things bit by bit. So this incremental thing I'm a big fan. So I'll let you talk through what this specifically is, but this is the blog post that taught me about it. And then just a few other resources here. We've got the Upgrade Assistant, which helps on converting over an existing application. And it will go through, and I think it helps get you started. It'll convert over like your project. It'll convert your NuGet packages. It'll also flag additional work that you need to do. There's also guidance here. So in the docs, we've got all this guidance on migrating, and this has all the technical work that needs to be done. And then one other thing here is we've got this ebook. So this is porting existing ASP.NET apps to .NET 6. And this is a full-on ebook. It's hundreds of pages. And so this is all, as we were talking about before, Andrew or Taylor, this is existing guidance. What you're going to be showing is some kind of new stuff. And I'll just make sure to post that link over. So what's kind of different about this new approach?
I think the main thing is a lot of the guidance has been with the idea that you can just kind of stop work, focus on getting all of your ASP.NET Framework stuff moved over to ASP.NET Core. Like you go dark for like a while. Like when I've worked with customers who are doing this, it's a multi-year process for some of these people.
Yeah.
And so that guidance just didn't work. And so the point of this effort has been to come up with a actual way of applying the strangler fig pattern in a prescriptive way that can just get people going. We've seen this pattern arise, like the stuff I'll be showing and talking about. Some of these things arise in different ways, both internally and externally with customers I've worked with. And so we're just trying to bring all of the learnings from these different people and organizations into one set of patterns and processes that overall tend to work. there's no like one size fits all for this. Everyone has their own application. Like John, you were talking about how you had worked on doing ASP.NET Classic to ASP.NET Framework. Like I've seen that with some of these customers, they have to do something slightly differently at times because of some of the legacy stuff they have, or they were coming from a VB6 application heavily using COM, and then they had migrated that over to ASP.NET over time. And you have some of these old patterns that are still there. And one of the things that we've learned through this process is that a lot of the guidelines we say are with the current best practices that we wish people were doing now. And that's great if you're doing a greenfield app. If you are starting off with a new application, you can start using whatever is like the latest and greatest patterns, like dependency injection and like separation of concerns. A lot of these things that weren't as readily available or just not as accepted as best practices when your application was actually starting to be built. And so you have different patterns there, and it becomes difficult to retrofit. So that's kind of like the high level of some of where we get started, but I'll dive into some of the challenges that are actually the driving thing for this project.
Very cool. Okay.
So I did want to hit on a comment I saw. Someone asked about .NET Core 2. ASP.NET Core 2.2 migration to like .NET 6, ASP.NET 6 migration. This is not going to be addressing that. That is a much different thing and generally a lot easier. I saw some other people put in comments that you can generally change the TFM and update packages. There is some more. There is some. Oh, shoot, John, I'm going to have to jump off. My computer, my graphics card just overheated, and so I can't see anything. So I'll have to join back in just a sec.
No worries. Cool.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Well, he's gone. There is some guidance. I want to go back to just a second. Oh, that's a new one. I do want to share this. I guess I'll remove. I don't know. He's just frozen. It's awesome. Okay. I'm going to share my screen again because there is some guidance specifically on different version migrations. So, well, it's not always, that's true. Taylor did freeze with a smile. That is good. Usually when I freeze with a ridiculous look on my face. So there is guidance in here, for instance, like, 2.2 to 3.0, or so between versions. It's really tough because there's so many combinations, right? You could go 2.2 to 5, or you could go whatever. In general, the earlier versions were harder. I would say after around 2.1, 2.2, things tended to get more locked down. There you go, 2.2 to 7. That's a good one. I have found, like, for instance, I'll do demos where I'll say, let's upgrade a .NET 5 app to .NET 6, and I'll open it, change the TFM to 6, and we're done. So the guidance I give people is there is a lot of new stuff that you can take advantage of that you don't have to. So I don't know if Taylor will cover this, but generally the steps, the incremental migration steps, I start with get it running and then take advantage of the new features and take advantage of the new patterns. So if you try and update everything all at once, super hard. If you go a little bit at a time, that's easier. So what, I guess while we're waiting on Taylor, as he's coming back, in this blog post, there's some cool stuff showing, for instance, he's going to be showing using YARP. Let me make sure actually that I've got my Teams open in case he gets back in touch with me there, because that'll be neat. Okay. So YARP is really cool, and that's kind of part of the secret here is there's two parallel apps running side by side, one pointing at the other. So this is what this addresses exactly. So moving from like .NET 4.8, et cetera. So the problem is that those those things are more difficult, and you've got to like manage things like side-by-side authentication. You've got you want your end users to be able to log into an app. They don't need to know which parts are running on core and which are running on framework. And so that's the secret sauce here is you've got this YARP proxy that is making the two of them work together. So let me just see if he's contacting me yet. I'll ping him on here. Oh, did I hear something? Yes, wonderful. Okay. All right, what's new?
Okay, just a sec. Let me share my screen again. I am sorry about that.
No worries. I was ad-libbing a bit, just talking about this general.
Perfect.
Yeah.
We had the first hot weekend of the year here, right? This past weekend.
Yeah.
And so issues that I haven't had to deal with heat have started showing up, it seems. So I'm going to have to rethink some of how I've got some of my setup here structured with heat.
Yep.
And so, okay, I think we're going to go. It may not be as smooth because I'll have to get some stuff set up along the way. But yeah, so the challenges we had focused on through this process after watching a number of external companies as well as internal, like you can look on the .NET blog of some of the internal customers that have been going through this process, that we've identified two main challenges that seem to be the biggest roadblocks initially. And to be clear, this is not all of the challenges we've seen or we want to fix or find some way to help you all with. But these end up being the ones that seem to take the longest for people to figure out what to do and how to go about it. So the first one is a number of libraries out there in projects have been written against HTTP context, the System.Web version of HTTP context. And it's different than the ASP.NET Core version. Sometimes drastically different, sometimes subtly different, but there's always differences. And it often ends up being a death by 1,000 paper cuts. Mm-hmm. And so people will sometimes take this as a chance to just go through and re-architect things and pull out the dependency of system.web.http context. And that's for a lot of people the main dependency they have on system.web.dll. There are other things, and that's something we would like to address at some point as well. But this is like the main thing people are using. Like you deep in the bowels of your application, you've got HTTP context.current, and you're getting a header, you're getting a cookie, you're setting something.
Yeah.
You're getting the user, whatever. Like a lot of little things here and there, but it adds up.
Architecturally, like moving from framework to core, that was definitely a big thing that I had to think about differently. The context was so easy to use.
Yes.
Like you're saying, anywhere you're just like, give me the user, give me the headers, give me the whatever.
Yeah.
But it's also, my understanding too, is terrible for performance as well.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. It definitely is. One of the goals we have with this endeavor, though, is to not force people to re-architect things, to meet people with where they're at. That yes, it's not a great performance to do HTTP context.current, but you're already using it, and you've already made that decision. Like let's try to meet you where you are and enable your current application with as little effort as possible. Mm-hmm. The second main challenge has been, how do you incrementally move to ASP.NET Core while still innovating and providing value to the business? Here at Microsoft, we sometimes forget that software is not the focus of every company. A lot of companies produce software to facilitate whatever their business is, but it ends up not getting as high priority often to take the time and effort to fully, just like, as I said, go dark and do it all. With large applications, this can take a long time. So we wanted to come up with a pattern of how to apply that strangler fig pattern to move your application forward and be able to light up functionality on ASP.NET Core in a way that you can continue to deploy. And it becomes something that you can just start turning on new endpoints, new routes as they become available. And how can you
describe that strangler fig pattern, what that means?
Yeah, so I'll get to that in just a sec of kind of how it applies here. But the high level view of it is that the strangler fig pattern allows you to start in one state and slowly start carving stuff off and replacing it with something new. But I'll get into how that's actually applied here, because that's kind of the value that we see from what we're currently working on, is the actual application of it. So to start with, though, I wanted to talk about some adapters we've built for System.Web. And so this is a library that I'll send a link to, but it's Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.System.Web Adapters. And what it does is it provides a System.Web.HTTP context. It has the same signature. It actually will type resolve on framework to the System.Web.dll version, but it is implemented against ASP.NET Core's version of HTTP context. We're also exposing HTTP context.current. So as long as you're taking this new library, it will just work. HTTP response, request, HTTP session state, HTTP cookie collection, and more. That and more is something we're looking for feedback from the community as to what APIs are you using. We started with ones we've seen internally with customers, NuGet packages, but we know that there's more, and some of them are ones we could definitely expose. Some of them you're just going to have to find a new way of doing, because it just doesn't translate in a reasonable way. But for the things that we can make some sort of adapter that you can drop in a replacement to compile, and you get the information you need, you'll be able to set the information you need. That's the goal for these adapters, that it will allow you to change what you're referencing and you're able to move forward. I recently worked with a customer that they dropped this into a project that they've been working 6 months on trying to come up with their own way of adapting it. We dropped it in. We missed 2 APIs that they had been using, an indexer and HTTP collection, and an HTTP cookie property we hadn't put on. We added those on, and so now they should be good to go.
Oh, wow.
And so this is one of those things that we're hoping will make it so you can just get some of those libraries moving forward. Because through the migration process, you need to start with your libraries. Get those libraries converted to core, to .NET Standard. But if you're using System.Web way down in the depths, like I've seen customers who have dependency trees with depths tens of libraries deep that are using System.Web. So how do you go about that? That's what this is for. Some of the features of it is that it will implicitly convert between the ASP.NET Core version and the HTTP context from System.Web. So in your logic, you're just using System.Web.HTTP context. When you need to get the ASP.NET Core version or the ASP.NET version of it, you just pass it into a function that is expecting it, and there's an implicit converter that will do it. Performance-wise, it's cached once per request as a feature within the ASP.NET Core HTTP context. So you only create one of these things per request. So if you end up needing to do a lot of conversions back and forth, it's relatively cheap. But it allows you to not really care about it, and you don't have to go through and start adding calls to like two System.Web HTTP context or whatever. It just kind of works. Another thing is the library supports .NET Standard, .NET Framework, 4.7.2, and .NET 6. And so this allows you to move your business logic potentially to .NET Standard if all you were relying on was the System.Web.HTTP context. And that's something that can be very helpful for the migration process, as we often see people just preferring to get to .NET Standard when they're doing this for various reasons. Some of it being that there's some tooling differences that make it a little bit more challenging for custom scripts that you may have, that if you can get it .NET Standard, you have one assembly, it can simplify it.
Yeah.
These libraries, when running on .NET Framework, it just type forwards, unifies with the stuff in System.Web. So you can just continue going on. Your framework app will continue to function without anything new. And that's just transparent. There's no performance implication there. And on the ASP.NET Core side, you have very minimal code that's needed to configure it. But there is the ability to override stuff, to implement certain features, like session, for instance. I'll talk about that later. That it's a very different beast. And so you may have ways you might want to tweak things and have control over some things. And so you can do that, but you generally just have to do that in your program.cs. There are a few things you have to opt into in order to get certain behaviors. Things like some ability, like on ASP.NET Framework, you could do something like input string input stream dot length, and you would get a length potentially. And in order to do that on core, we have to pre-buffer things, and so that has a cost. So things that have a cost to mimic, you have to opt in using metadata and just with the ASP.NET Core framework. And so you can add a attribute to a controller, and then it's there. You can also add it in globally, and it will light up. And I'll show that in a demo. So now let's talk a little bit about the strangler fig pattern. So the point of it is to slowly migrate. Again, this can take a long time for many people. We have often been talking about it as this one shot and you're done kind of thing. When we show Upgrade Assistant, we will often show it as you run it, you push enter, 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 and it works. But that doesn't work for ASP.NET Core. There's so many differences, and it becomes death by 1,000 paper cuts. And you want to be able to migrate in a way that you can have assurance that what you're migrating is going to work. And so if you do a full conversion over, then you've got a whole bunch of stuff you got to test. So the unit of work that we're talking about in this is a route. And that could be an endpoint, a controller, an MVC, a page and web forms, an IHTTP handler implementation, or anything that is returned by like some sort of concept of a route or endpoint. And that's like the unit of work that you can migrate over in one go with the strangler fig pattern. And so the setup we have that we're recommending right now is we add in an ASP.NET Core application as the entry point that all of your traffic comes into. And then it will service any requests it can from there, but otherwise it will use YARP to reverse proxy back to your framework application. So that looks in practice kind of like this, where you start with an initial state where you have your external traffic coming into your ASP.NET application. And then you have all this business logic and various libraries, whatever. The first step is to add in an ASP.NET Core application. This application initially doesn't do anything. It will just forward everything onto the framework app. And so that's why this ASP.NET application is a lot bigger than the ASP.NET Core application. Everything is still there. But because you're now downstream from a proxy, you may need to take care of a few things. It may not work in the same way. And we've got some documentations on some known issues, and we're interested in other issues you may encounter. The next step would be to take your business logic and start compiling them against the adapters. Get that working so you'll have workable code so that you could have the logic you actually need to enable your endpoints. If you move over a controller, but you don't have your business logic actually able to run a .NET Core, it's not really worthwhile. So you got to do both of these things kind of together, but you're able to slice off a single route to do it. So over time, these routes will move over to the core application. And that will allow you to get to a point where all of your logic is now in core. You're doing it one by one with the routes. Depending on the technology that you have for your route, some of this will be easier than others, of course. So things like Web API is probably the easiest. And then things like MVC, the MVC on ASP.NET Core is a pretty good analog. There's some changes you will have to make, but overall it's not as difficult. Web forms, we understand the pain there. It's something we are exploring. The best model for that has been Blazor. And so you're able to take a web form page and convert that to a Blazor page. It doesn't currently work in this setup for some reasons we are working on, but that is the migration path that we tend to see people going for with that. But that one is a bit more work just because you have to rework things. I know Jeff Fritz has some libraries that can help with this, and that's something we're hoping to be able to bring into this whole story here. At this point, you've hopefully moved everything out of your framework app so you can get rid of it. And now you're purely on ASP.NET Core. One thing to keep in mind with this is you want to try to minimize changes. It becomes difficult if you're trying to move to Linux and Kestrel at the same time. That if you've been running your ASP.NET Framework application on IIS, you can totally do Kestrel and Linux at the same time, and if it works, that's awesome. But often we see that you have some dependencies on certain behaviors that it's easier just to stick with the same deployment mechanism and get it moved over to core and then deal with any of the fallout And there's great tooling and analyzers to identify like platform inconsistencies, APIs you're using that aren't available on like Linux if you want to move there. But trying to keep that deployment mechanism and getting yourself to core, it can open up a whole new world of the tooling available that will make some of that stuff easier.
I think that's really key that you pointed out there is try and change one thing at a time. Changing, I mean, I think that's just a good general software development practice anyways. A lot of my most difficult bugs I've run into is when I change too many things at once.
Yes.
And now I'm not sure. And it's an interaction between them all. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. And that's one of the reasons we're trying to come up with this guidance, because sometimes it's hard to identify what does that mean to make one change at a time. Because you may want to get to Kestrel and Linux with all of ASP.NET Core and with your big application, but you may not realize that you still have some common dependencies somewhere down in the stack that's going to be something you got to deal with at some point. But if you stay on .NET Core on Windows, it's probably going to be a bit easier. So at this point, I'm going to hop over and show kind of what this looks like to set up. So we have an extension that we have added. Need to finish setting up something. Okay, so we have an extension that we've created that will help with some of the initial setup for this. There are currently some discussions on how do we combine this with the upgrade assistant effort. And so we have one consistent tooling story there. Currently, it's a separate thing just so we can get people going on this. Long term, we're working on what that story looks like.
And so, I went through and did this recently, and it was super like this. I was surprised how well this worked.
Yeah, because it's not actually doing too much, and it's not doing too much that's actually new, but it's helping with some of the steps that may have been difficult to do. So it's this Microsoft project migrations. It's currently marked as experimental. We just put a new release out last week with Preview 2, and so I'll be showing that. But it does fairly minimal to your project, and currently, once you've set up the new project, you don't need it anymore. And so I've already got it installed, so we won't do that. But if you go search online for this extension, add it, then what happens is you get a new option in here called Migrate Project. And we click Start Project, and we're just going to have a given new project. It's much easier if you just start with a new project because.
So you have an existing .NET Framework ASP.NET application.
Yep, and I'll kind of explain what the structure of that is in a second. Cool. But it already exists. This is the application you currently have. You'd right-click on that one. Yeah. So let's create a new project. We're going to go with .NET 6 because that's the LTS version. And we're just going to go finish. And it will do a few things. It installs some NuGet packages. It sets a few things up. And I'll kind of walk through what those changes look like. So the first thing to take a look at, we'll just hop over here to the Get Changes thing to see the actual changes. So you'll see in your ASP.NET Framework application a few properties that have been added to the project file. And this is just some information so that we can identify what kind of migration you're doing. Currently, we only have YARP. We've tried some others that's what this discriminator is for. But it also helps link the project together.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, yeah, what are these actually used for? Because I saw that added and I'm like,
yep.
If I deleted that, would it break? Like, what would happen?
Currently, it's not used for anything, but it will allow us to use tooling to be able to read your project file and say, oh, here's a project that is being migrated to this project.
Got it.
So then we can come up with some helpful gestures and tooling that could perform some actions for you. And so that's all that it's doing here. It's just saying, hey, I'm migrating to a core app. And so here's what the core app's like. The interesting stuff to take a look at here is that in the app settings, we're adding some boilerplate for a reverse proxy. This is using YARP. Don't have time right now to dive into how YARP works, but it's the reverse proxy that we are working on that is used internally by a number of teams, and it allows you to programmatically define where routes go.
Yeah.
We also set up launch settings that will add an environment variable to your framework app. And I'll get to why that is important in a second. But this way, when you run your application, it will know where that initial app was. The program.cs is mostly the same. We've added some service registrations for add System.Web Adapters. And we have added some middleware, use System.Web Adapters. And initially, that's all you got to do. And depending on what you're actually doing, the use System.Web Adapters may not even be needed. It depends if you're opting into any of the functionality that middleware adds, but it doesn't add much just to put that in there.
So, and I know there's all kinds of edge and corner cases and stuff.
Yeah.
Are there any kind of like main known gotchas or places where this, as you pointed out, it's not doing a whole ton of stuff. So it seems like this would work in most cases. Like,
yeah, we haven't seen any problems of how this could impact a existing ASP.NET Core application. But again, if you guys hit any of that stuff, let us know. We have we're working on GitHub in the .NET org, and we'll put a link wherever links are put on this.
Yeah, I've already shared it in the chat, and then it'll go in the description on YouTube.
Perfect. A couple other interesting things about this project is we have a library, and this library is using HTTP context.current. It's using HTTP context base. This is for demo purposes only, so it's doing the immensely important business function of getting a user agent. But it's being done in a class library. And so this could potentially be way down in your stack. And then we are pulling that information in one of the controllers to show that information, which apparently it's not here right now. But we could pull that in. So let's add that reference, and then we will put the message as test library dot class1 dot get user agent. Okay. So when we run this application, it's going to run both of these. So if you right click on here and go to set startup projects, the extension that you ran will have added them as multiple startup projects. And that's because we are using both of them. The framework app will be running in the background, the core app will be running in the foreground, and anything that's not available in the core app gets requested from the framework app in the background. So
and at this point, the way you showed the YARP settings, it's a catch-all route. Everything's forwarding to the back end.
Correct. Yes. Good catch. Yes. There are no controllers in the core app. There's nothing that would end up hijacking the request in any way. Okay. So here's the ASP.NET Framework app. If we were to launch the Framework app, we would see that this is all it is. You see that there's some identity here. You see that there's a whole bunch of styling and stuff, and that's something that you probably customize in your own way. So let's start applying some more of the adapter stuff to get some stuff working. So first thing, let's convert the test library to standard. This is going to be relatively simple because not first. We got to first add the adapter project itself. So because we have it in the solution level, we can just go to manage NuGet packages here, look at the installed ones, and we'll add the System.Web Adapters. And we're just going to add them to both because the framework app, it doesn't get installed there by default. But if you're going to be using it in the same project, NuGet packages don't flow to the old style ASP.NET projects. And so you end up with needing to add that directly. So now that we have this in the test library project, we can remove this and let's just compile it with Network 7.2, keeping in mind that's not changed too much at one time. So now we see that it works. It's still a Network 7.2, but it's going to be going in System.Web Adapters. Now we can change this to .NET Standard, and let's build it. Let me get finished. There we go. And it works as well. So now we've got that. Let's add this to the core app so that we can make use of some of the shared business logic. And we're just going to add this as using some minimal APIs to get some information. So paste that in here. As long as it is after the use System.Web Adapters, this stuff should work. You'll see that this is still going to the same business logic, but now it's going to be serviced by these endpoints. So let's start this back up, and we'll see that if we hit these two endpoints, the core app will serve that using the same shared business logic that would be shared from the ASP.NET framework. So by the way, if we go to About, that shows it from the framework side. This is using that shared business logic. But if we go to test 1, we see the same thing, but it's just coming from ASP.NET Core. If we use test 2, it's doing the same thing, but this one's not using, the first one is using HTTP context, and it's implicitly converting it into HTTP context base, while the second one is using HTTP context.current. Either of these work, whatever pattern you're using in your project. So that's kind of how you get started. So now there's some other things that you might want to think about in your project.
So we got two questions. Just wanted to throw in here first. So you've got a core app and a framework app. You could host these separately, right? You can have YARP pointing. Okay.
Yep, that's one of the really nice things about this. It becomes just like any microservice pattern you might have, or any client-server relationship you might have. You follow whatever patterns you like doing there. You can deploy, once you get a few things set up in your framework app, you could just have that deployed, and your core app could be something you're doing in test that is hitting against like some already deployed test framework app that you don't even want to touch anymore, but you're now using it on core side, and you can start trying that incremental stuff there. So yes, totally can deploy to different places.
I'd imagine later on, I think you're going to be talking about things like sharing authentication or stuff like that. Those cases would require more, or would make it more difficult to host separately, right?
Yeah, more around some of the security concerns. Like you'll want to make sure that when we get to some of the remote stuff, that best practice, you're going to want that to be over HTTPS anyway. But like if you're doing it in Azure, for instance, you'd probably want to set up some sort of network isolation, just like really keep that secure, depending on what your security concerns are. But yes, it just becomes like any sort of two-service microservice setup.
Cool. Okay. Question: if you want, let me see, an API with a JavaScript SPA front end, do you need a client router that knows? So yeah, how does this work with JavaScript front end?
Yeah, it should be the same. Nothing. You should just you'd want that to point to the ASP.NET Core version. If you point to the ASP.NET Core, then it'll light up. If you're servicing a certain API from ASP.NET Core, then it will get you that information from ASP.NET Core. But if you haven't implemented it yet there, it will handle forwarding it to the backend. Which brings the point that framework app could be behind firewalls. It could be something that you don't even have publicly accessible anymore. But depending on what your process looks like, if you want to be able to keep people just accessing framework while you're testing stuff, that's up to you.
You did mention too some of the stuff with because it's microservices and you can host separate, you could even, I'm thinking back to the previous question, but you could even have your core app hosted in Docker or Linux or whatever, right? And your framework backend is still an IIS on your Windows server, maybe in-house or something,
Totally. Yeah, that's how I do some of my testing locally with this stuff anyway.
Oh, cool.
So it totally works.
Okay.
Yep. Wow. So let's talk a little bit about session. A lot of people use HTTP context.session. And when you go to ASP.NET Core, you see it's not the same thing. Same name, but not the same. The two main differences you'll notice very quickly, one maybe more quickly than the other, and one that you may not realize you're relying on. The first is that it's strongly typed. So you have a session key, you can say like, this is an int, or this is my POCO, this is whatever object you care about. You can't do that in ASP.NET Core. In ASP.NET Core, it's a key value with string byte array. That's all it is. It makes it very efficient. It's not opinionated on any of the serialization technologies, but it makes it hard to move forward, like to use, to migrate over.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is ASP.NET Framework has a reliable session that during the course of a request, it gets locked and other requests can't modify it. You may or may not realize it's doing this, but you may have taken a dependency on that behavior. And so that's something that also can pose challenges, and that can cause bugs you may not realize, like how to even like diagnose where that's coming from. And so what we've come up with are a couple ways to handle it. So session support in general is something that you got to opt in with the adapters. But once you do, you can just access it off the system.web.http://context.session as if it were your normal session. We have two patterns that we are currently have made available, but this is something that's totally overridable. There's an interface that you can implement that will give it whatever strategy you want, but then it will be surfaced in that http://context.current or the http://context.session on the core side. Overriding it on framework is a much different beast. So that leads to the first method we've come up with is a remote application session. This is just piggybacking off of whatever you're doing on framework. So we have a mechanism by which you can expose an endpoint on your framework application that allows you to query the session state for the whatever user session is currently open.
Okay.
This allows you to not care about where that's stored. You don't have to deal with any session providers or anything on framework side that you may have customized. That's something that you can deal with at a later point in the migration process.
Is that like a REST endpoint sort of thing, or?
Yeah, internally it's implemented as a module and handler setup.
Okay.
But there's some docs that describe what that protocol looks like.
Cool.
It is overridable. Well, it's kind of tricky on the framework side to override stuff because DI is not as baked into things.
Yeah.
But our plan is that it is something you can customize if you want to do it in your own way. But there's a pattern we set up that it should work for most people. The only challenge is that we are not going to guess at what those types are. You have to identify that. You have to register that in some way. And I'll show that in a sec. We do have it so that if you attempt to use a session key or a session key is found that a type is unknown, it will log a warning for you. By default, it also errors out, but you can override that to just silently log a warning, and then you can go through your logs and identify, oh, there's this key. What is this type? And then you register it. Another mode that's available is where you can have it just built on top of the ASP.NET Core session concept. So using the ICE session from ASP.NET Core, that's just that string byte array, and that's all it is. You can this will add a layer above it so that you're still using that backing, but you can access it in a strongly typed way. It will not have that reliable characteristic that you may be relying on, but it will allow you to not need the framework application. We are definitely interested in feedback on these approaches. There's additional approaches we could take that probably would take more work, but there are things that we have some ideas on other options, but this is kind of what we're starting with.
Okay.
So I won't go through the exact protocol because we're running short on time, but it's in the docs. Take a look at the GitHub page for some of the details on how some of this works. I talked a bit about the wrapped session, so I'll just hop into a demo. So let's add a little bit of session usage to this library that we have. So I'll just paste it in here. I'm adding a few methods that one will set a value. You give it some message, and it will just set a session of message. And it's doing it with some custom POCO session value. It just has a string property. And then you have a get value that will attempt to get that message, and then it will just return it. And then we'll just give you some value if it's not set. And then I have a method here that we're going to use the inbuilt JSON serialization, where you can just give it a mapping of, it will give you a dictionary, and you can just register a session key and the type that it's expected. And then it will just use JSON serialization for each of those types, both, more importantly, to deserialize. So that's what that logic looks like. Let's hook it up on the core app where we will use it. So, that's the framework app. So the core app, we're going to add a few more endpoints. So we're going to add a session set, which will have a query parameter of message, and that's just going to call into that shared logic. And we have to add this require System.Web Adapter session. This adds some metadata to that endpoint that will run some middleware that will actually reach out to the remote app and migrate an actual session object for you. Because that has a cost, you opt into it. And you can opt into it in any way that you would opt into this kind of metadata system. So like if you're on a controller, there's a session attribute that you can add onto a controller and it will enable it there. Or on all the controllers, you can also just do require System.Web Adapter session. And then it will just be enabled for all of them. And then you can slowly opt out of it for different endpoints as you identify, oh, I don't need it. There's a lot of patterns there, but it's flexible in how you use it. We also have to register the information that will be needed. So first, let's add the JSON session serializer. So there's some options we want to set up. And we're going to call into this library here that we have some shared logic for registering session keys. And we're just going to pass into it this known keys property. Next, we're going to register the remote app session. Now there are two things that you need to do on the core side. One is register an API key. The other is set up where are we looking. Some of this configuration we are hoping to simplify. But right now, the easiest way to grab it is to take a look at this app settings and just get it from the configuration. So we'll do remote app URL, and we'll grab it from the configuration. So that's reverse proxy. It's kind of a long one for it because we don't have clusters. Callback cluster, destinations, app, and finally address. And this is something that we set in that launch settings, and it's something that you can set in a production app any way that you set configuration. Okay. And then we'll need to add session to the framework app. And so we'll need to add the NuGet package for it. We currently have a separate NuGet package for the session. We're hoping to be able to combine it, so it's something that you can just have one of. Okay. We'll let NuGet do its thing. There we go. Okay, and then configuration for this, we do in global.asx. And currently we have it set up so that we add some methods that will register stuff to the application. And it follows a similar pattern. We're hoping to get it so that it's the same pattern as you do on core, so it can just be a concept that you don't have to think about too much. But right now we have we have a set of extension methods that you'll use to set it up. So the first thing is you have to do pretty much the same kind of setup you do on core. So first you do the library to register API keys first. So we just did test keys. So in production, you're going to want something a bit more secure. but we'll just use that for now. So we'll go back into the test library for registering the session keys, and that should be it. We do add a module into the application, and this just hooks into that module. You can see that right here. And there's an issue that we're trying to figure out the best way to handle that sometimes certain requests aren't handled on the framework. So for right now, adding this handlers in works, and we'll either have that added in automatically, or we'll figure out what the better process that would be.
And I think, like you were saying too, like you'd want to make sure it's HTTPS, and
yes,
potentially also like from firewall perspective or whatever, you'd want to prevent external connection maybe to that. So only allow between the two servers.
Correct. Yes, we highly recommend that for these endpoints we're exposing that you do secure connection over it. Oh, must have missed something. Okay, so again, it goes to the framework app initially. Let's go back to the program.ca so we can look at what the endpoints we're looking for. So we have a session set that we can give it a message and a session get. So let's do session get. Session value not set. Again, it's calling into that logic, that shared logic. Let's change it to set. We'll put message, hello. Set session to hello. Session get, and now it's getting it from hello. Again, that's through session, and it's calling into the framework application for this information.
Okay. So this allows any logic that requires that session. Now both your core and your framework application can work against that same shared session.
Exactly. Yep. At some point, you may want to pivot away from that, and you may be isolated a section that you just want to have session using like the ASP.NET Core session. And so we have a way to wrap the ASP.NET Core session. And if you do it like this, then that will work. That will now just go against the I session from ASP.NET Core.
Okay.
But it still gives you that guarantee of type safety, but not the reliability. That is something you could potentially add as a layer on top if you would like. But you'd have to find some way to lock against sessions.
Okay.
Okay. So the next thing is authentication. This is always one of the first questions I hear asked, and we have an answer for, but it's probably not the one you're going to want to stick with for long. But a lot of this is seen as an incremental process, and sometimes like you start off with one mechanism because that lets you get running with getting on core, and then you're going to want to look for a better mechanism. And we're hoping to have that set of guidance of when you would want to use which of these mechanisms through this process. But the authentication support at the moment is currently, we recommend just to set up auth on the ASP.NET Core app directly if possible. This works great for things like JOT tokens. You do not need to necessarily have it think of the framework app as a source of truth for it. You could just have it go directly to like Azure AD or Azure B2C or whatever you're using there.
Yeah. Okay.
However, if you have logic in your framework app that makes it the source of truth, for instance, using identity or using membership, or you're using, even if you're just customizing claims transformations that you're not really sure of quite yet, we have a remote option similar to session that will allow you to just hook into that, grab that claims information, and then use that locally on the ASP.NET Core side. There's still open questions on some of these. Windows Auth does not work in this way. So Windows Auth is not something that's currently supported in this framework, with this setup. Windows Auth in general has challenges with proxies. And so that's something that we're still figuring out what's the best way to migrate that. There's also some known issues around like WS Federation, and there's going to be corner cases with a lot of these things. And we're looking for feedback because we can only test and identify so many permutations of all the technologies here that are possible. Oh yeah, so the ones that are supported right now are like OWN cookies, ASP.NET Identity through that remote aspect, JOT tokens, forms auth. These are things with the remote auth. If you're able to get it just on ASP.NET Core side, by all means, do it that way. It's going to be better. It's going to be more secure. That's your first step if you're able. But if not, remote auth will work. Not supported yet are the Windows auth, WS Fed, fully. We have some PR. We're hoping for Preview 3 to have that working. And then there's some issues around ASP.NET Identity for logging out. And again, we're hoping to figure that out.
Okay.
So let me show that in action. So let's go back to this application. Let's put that remote app session back. And now we're going to add remote app authentication. There's two parameters that this takes. One is it the default scheme? We're just going to say true. Otherwise, it would be something that you'd have to opt into for an authentication scheme. However you currently are doing that, just like you do with any other scheme that you might want to have in your application. It just builds on top of that ASP.NET authentication infrastructure.
Okay.
But let's add in the options for this. Yes, there's some duplication here, and that is something we're hoping to fix in the next preview. We've got setting that remote app URL. Okay, so that's the configuration there. Let's add an endpoint that will use your authentication. So we'll add auth test that will grab your identity, and then we'll just list out your claims. And this is using the require authorization to let ASP.NET Core know we need authorization to be able to hit this endpoint. One other thing we need to add is we need to add the use authentication. And it is important that this is done before using System.Web Adapters. Okay, so with that, then we just go over to the global ASEX again, and let's add in the remote app authentication. So here's the options and the API key. That's what we got to do. So now let's run it and see these claims showing up in your ASP.NET Core side.
While it's spinning up, it's a good time to ask, what's the performance considerations on this? Like,
that's a very good question. Let's finish this and then I'll answer.
Okay.
That. Yeah, because that's not a quick answer.
Okay.
What was the endpoint for this? It was auth test. Now you see on the core side, it's thinking it's text, but you see all of the claims showing up. And again, that's on the core side. So if we were to put that here, let's refresh it. And now we've got this identity that's just a claims identity. And it's got the information of what I signed into on the framework app.
Okay.
So that is just released last week. So there are some issues that have come in already. And we are very interested, again, in all of the permutations that may be available of that. So someone asked about auth. The auth concerns are definitely there. I'm not auth, performance concerns.
Yeah.
Performance concerns are definitely there. You're adding in potentially a new hop that didn't exist before. If you co-locate those servers like on the same IIS instance, then it's not going to be as big of a hop. It's definitely something just like any performance concern. Benchmark it, see if that's the actual concern. A lot of the ASP.NET stuff on the framework side will probably eclipse some of these performance concerns if you're on IIS. I do have some I have an open issue that I've been exploring some ways of adding in some diagnostic tracing into these adapters so that you can actually get measurements of what the cost on the ASP.NET Core side is of being able to do things like hydrate session or calling out to remote auth. That's not available yet, but that will just be hopefully something coming in one of the previews that you can just turn on and collect the data and see for yourself, measure what it's like in your environment. Because those calls will add some overhead, but the adapters themselves, infrastructure itself, shouldn't add too much more. And again, if you identify something that is a bottleneck, if it's something with the adapters, then that's something we'll want to fix. But it may also just be something that, like ASP.NET Framework, you were doing a lot of stuff with strings.
Yeah.
And so you end up using strings a lot rather than like the path string or some of these more performant structures that are used on core.
So in general, the performance improvements of moving to core probably help quite a bit.
Right. Like when I've done some perf testing on this, the thing that's going to take the longest is just getting that information from the framework app. And so that's why if you're able to move the auth locally, or if you don't care about some of the session stuff, try to move that over as soon as you can. But it's also a trade-off of functionality and performance here.
Yeah.
Do you want that correctness of like the most accurate migration that you have functionally it's the same? You can do A/B testing to decide when you actually want to turn on endpoints to be public, but it's one of those things that it's like any performance testing, that identify where the bottlenecks are and then see if you can mitigate that.
Okay. One performance related question sort of here is there a significant memory overhead for YARP?
I am not aware of. Okay. I don't know enough about that to know.
My tiny minimal bit of testing and playing with it is a super lightweight. Like it's definitely.
I know that it tries to stream as much stuff as possible, so it's not going to be like it's going to have some working sets, some impact, but again, it's something that can be measured for your application.
Yeah,
and it's something that
directly.
Oh, go ahead.
Probably a lot of it relates to just how many routes you have, like in your, you know what I mean? Like if you have tons of manual configuration in YARP, I guess.
Yeah, potentially. I don't know what the impact is there. Yeah. I know that YARP is tracking a lot of performance kind of stuff, and it's being actively developed. Yeah. That's one of the reasons this pattern is built on that. We had other prototypes that we had tried out that tried different ways of doing it, but it built on infrastructure that would have been unique to this setup. Yeah. But by building on YARP, we get any gains that are made just in YARP, because YARP is already used for other things, internally, externally, that it's getting work on. So that's a big benefit of using YARP for this. Yeah,
YARP is being used at huge scale at Microsoft, I've heard. So yeah.
Yes, it has.
One other question here related to auth. Will anti-forgery tokens just work as they do now?
When I mentioned earlier that there's some issues with some parts of it, that's one of them. So that's an open issue. We're trying to figure out how to handle that.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that's kind of all I had. Here's where you can go to learn more. There's some docs there that we don't currently have anything on the docs on Microsoft, but we do plan on having that by the end of by the release of .NET 7. But it is something that you can go through the docs. And hopefully we try to keep them up to date so you can kind of see how to use it right now.
Okay. One other auth related question. Can you share auth using Owen?
Yes. Owen is actually part of this larger process that I didn't focus on today, but running Owen on ASP.NET Core is supported. There are some packages that help with that, and we're hoping to add some additional helpers to make that better. Like there may be some edge cases of running it, but you can run an Owen pipeline with an ASP.NET Core.
Okay. Another question here on timeline for Blazor support.
I don't know of a timeline. The main issue with it is not so much that Blazor doesn't work, because it does. It just Blazor and YARP are both fallbacks. So the priority of YARP supersedes Blazor, and so it will just end up going to the framework app, I believe. We have some ideas on it. There's Cocoon is a community project that we've been collaborating with, that they came up with a way of working around that. So we're hoping to get some way so that you can light it up. But you could use Blazor right now. The challenge with it, like I've seen people use it with this process and it works. Linking doesn't seem to work. Deep linking,
Okay.
or there's going to be gotchas that just won't work as well.
Oh, so Howard that asked that question says, yeah, he uses Cocoon. So.
Yep. We've been in contact with them, and they did a lot of great work. Independently, we didn't know about it, unfortunately, when we started this, but there's a lot of similar patterns we came up with, so it was kind of nice to see that consensus from the community as well, that these were patterns that others are seeing are viable.
Okay, cool. Wow. Okay, so that's great. I've shared the link, and the link is in the description below if you're watching later on YouTube. And then if people, you mentioned several times you're interested in input, what's the best way? Should people just file an issue on the repo, or?
The issue is going to be probably the best way. Okay. You're welcome to email me. I'm tasou@microsoft.com, and I can get that set up as well. There's like either of those ways will work. We're definitely looking for feedback on the process in general, as well as like the API decisions we've done and how well that works with your current what you're doing.
Okay. Well, did I spell that right?
Perfect. That is correct.
Awesome. Okay. So awesome. This was great. This is really interesting. I'm really happy to see. I'm happy to see the pattern. I'm also happy that this is based on real world stuff that your team has been doing and implementing with customers, because like you're saying, I've reviewed guidance before on updating applications, and every time my feedback was, you got to have more incremental migration stuff, because
totally.
Otherwise it's not,
it doesn't work.
Really use it.
Like it's nice for demos or POC, but when you're looking to actually move something, you need that process, and that's the main takeaway here. Like these adapters that we've released, I've written variants of that probably like 5 or 6 times for various customers, and we found through discussions internally that teams internally had done same thing, and so it's like, let's just get some consensus on what we should do here. Make sure we have one place that has all of that.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that it helps people in that process. And we know it's an onion. We know there's going to be that once like this solves some stuff. Yeah. But we know that there are going to be, once we get that done, there's going to be other blockers that feel huge as well. But hopefully this will get you past those initial hurdles that can be challenging just to get momentum going. It's nice.
It's nice too, the combination of like the code libraries and the guidance and the migration and the experience that you've brought to this process. Yeah. So having all that together. Very cool.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think we can wrap up there. Thank you so much for your time, Taylor. And we'll have you back on if you'd like later, if there are updates to this. Happy to continue.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for watching.